What's next for IT? In today's economy, technology touches every aspect of the day-to-day operations of business. There has never been more pressure on IT to deliver for our organizations. So what can we expect over the next decade? We need to think differently about how we approach our work to continue to thrive into the future. This requires all of us to be intentional in how we look at our role going forward. Smart IT is an approach to getting the important things done by transforming the way we think, work, and lead. And now, let's disrupt the status quo, simplify the complex, and reduce risk the smart IT way. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Smart IT Podcast. And today, I welcome Derek to the show. Hey, Derek. How's it going there?
Hey, hanging in there, doing well. How you doing?
Hey, doing pretty good. I'm always interested to kind of track what's going on at a macro level from an IT and security standpoint. And I know we had a chance to chat a little bit last week about all the things happening in the news from a cyber standpoint, and kind of want to get your thoughts and perspectives as organizations keep battling to keep the bad guys out, and when they find them, boot them out and recover and keep the business rolling. So I figure you'd be a good guy to hang out with for a little bit and chat and get your thoughts today.
Awesome. Yeah, I love talking shop and just things that are happening and what's going on.
So one of the big business level questions always, are we getting a good return on our investments when we manage cyber risk? And then another follow-up question is always going to be, how can we validate to make sure that our investments are working? So when we think about cybersecurity programs, it entails a lot of technology across the board, a lot of moving parts, processes, a lot of personnel, internal and external resources. And there's normally the CISO, if organizations have one, or sometimes it might be a security manager, given that role to kind of put all the different pieces together, to have a cohesive response to cyber threat actors. So you always want to wonder, how do you go about validating that the security controls are working? Now, in some places, it's like, hey, if email's out, all my internal systems are up and running, and we're not in the news, Derek, most organizations would be like, we're good to go. If the security operations center, the dashboards look green, the dashboards for the business side of the house are green, a lot of times we're feeling pretty good. And then sometimes something bad happens, and then all of a sudden things turn to yellow and they turn to orange, and it's like, holy crap, what happened there? So just if we zoom out just a little bit from the macro level of what's going on from a security standpoint and all these threats, some of the traditional approaches to answering, how well we're doing is like an audit or a health check or a good old fashioned end of the year annual pen test. So if I ask you, Derek, and say, hey, if I have a CISO come to you and he's sitting with the board of directors and they invite you in, Derek, for a conversation, and I ask you, hey, Derek, you've been around for a while. How do I know if all this stuff is working?
So I'm a fan of technical assessment, not necessarily questionnaire, right? There's many tool sets, some free, some paid, that are available to help you do a technical assessment. It's looking at your people, process, and technology. Breach and attack simulation, whether you look at it from an automation platform or like a red team pen test, is an important thing to look at. But we have lots of attack surface. We have Active Directory attack surface. We have cloud attack surface. We have our assets, where they sit. Do we even know all of our assets? So there's lots of ways to take a look at, are things working? Some of the tools that I like to use, a tool called Sempris to look at Active Directory, Entra ID, and Okta. So looking at the authentication and identity aspects. BAS tools. I like breach and attack sim from an automation. I like to call it a red team in a box. It's post-exploitation behavior, threat emulation. Scanning tools that the threat actors use themselves, like an advanced IP scanner or a net scanner, things of that nature. They help you find SMB shares, the juicy targets that the adversary is after. So with a relatively simple process, you can go through and take a nice big picture look at your environment from an attacker's perspective, which gives you a really good view of where you sit and maybe some of the things you might be missing.
So I like that, what you just said there, from the threat actor's perspective. Right? A lot of times we're doing our controls based off a framework, or an outsider came in and said, hey, you guys need these 20 tools. Make sure you got them up and running. And sometimes it can get lost in the shuffle is the threat actor is a human. They're part of organizations a lot of times. They have tactics, they have procedures, they have objectives. But I really like that. Let's hone in on this. Like, what might the attacker do? How might they do it? What might they go after? It's kind of a good way for a CISO and his team to actually kind of focus in on their limited time and resources. So let's talk a little bit about learning who these bad guys are and what they may go after.
So the adversary, if you really look at it and take a look at some of the reports that have been out, like this year, for instance, roughly 80, probably more, 80 is what we know, roughly 80% of attack campaigns are interactive hands-on keyboard, right? Credentials are huge for initial access and for lateral movement and action on objectives. So when you think about it from a defending point of view, there are a handful of things to kind of focus on. When I say 80% are interactive hands-on keyboard, what that means is the attacker's literally leading the campaign. They need a communication channel, and oftentimes they use a separate exfiltration channel. So looking at your perimeter and minimizing the amount of infill and exfil availability, looking at your host level, looking at credential dumps, things of that nature. I think a big trend right now is information stealers. So somebody clicks a link, information stealer comes in, it just grabs as much information as it can and sends it out. The log data is insane. That's what happened with Snowflake. Information stealer from legitimate environments were used to actually go in and pop many organizations on Snowflake because they didn't have multi-factor. So these are the kinds of trends that are happening. If you're a CISO, what are you looking for? What are you thinking about? If it's your environment that is under attack, credentials are huge, discovery, reconnaissance. They rarely does a threat actor land where they want to be, what they're looking for. So they scan, they use a legitimate administrative utilities. They use that post-exploitation thought process, living off the land, fileless attack methodologies to laterally move, find the data they're looking for, exfil the data. In the case of ransomware, they even use the administrative utilities to drop ransomware across as much of the infrastructure as possible and kick it off. So looking for this activity, understanding your assets. If you look at what happened with Microsoft, they had an asset that was non-prod, but it had way too much access. The Russian nation state actors were able to come in and take advantage of it. So these are the kinds of things we need to be aware of. Asset management. Do we know of our assets? Do we have a good understanding of them and the accesses they have, what the blast radius is? Those are the kinds of things we want to think about as we're looking to actively defend against a very aggressive adversary.
And that's the critical word you just used, actively, because I think in some security programs that are just getting off the ground, or maybe it's been up and running for 3 to 5 years, sometimes it's kind of like install something and they kind of forget about it. Maybe it's up and running, we think it's working. But like you said, we have people with hands-on keyboards on the other side of the wire, and they're looking, probing, searching. And as your infrastructure changes, right, because it's always changing, IT is always provisioning something new, spinning up something new sites, new containers, new wireless connections, new API connections, constantly to help support the business. On the other side, you got the bad guys who are constantly looking for opportunistic, openings and flaws. And if somebody going to put a database up on Amazon with just a username and password, if they find it, they're going to exploit it, right? So there's almost like this consistent beat that the offense itself, the defense has to be active as well. I know a lot of teams are kind of stressed and short on time and resources. And I don't think people sometimes realize what this active means here. So if you had a CISO in front of you thinking, hey, Derek, I would love to get some more resources, some more analysts, some more folks to dig in, but I'm just stretched thin. So how do I prioritize this? I know you hinted at this a little bit earlier about this prioritization, right? Where do I focus my limited time and money when I start to look at what these threat actors are doing?
Yeah. So, paying attention to cyber threat news is huge. I do that on a weekly basis, for instance, right? I'm looking for the most prolific behaviors and patterns of behavior, as well as the threat trends. This is how I know that the info stealer credentials are a huge trend. So using threat intel and taking advantage of it, what's important to your organization from a risk appetite perspective? What is your risk appetite for certain things? What are you trying to accomplish? I always like to say, do a business impact analysis. use that analysis to understand what's important. We want to look at critical business processes and the dependencies of those critical business processes. That's where we focus first. But what about something else that has access to those, right? So you kind of start at the most critical and work your way out to understand where you're at and prioritize based on threat intelligence. There's lots of really good threat intelligence and reports and capabilities out there. MITRE put out one called the Sightings Report. And what they found over little over a 2-year period is that 15 techniques covered 82% of attack campaigns. 1.6 million sightings is what they looked at after they normalized the data. So the adversary is doing a lot of the same things. You mentioned procedures. That's really what's changing. It's the battleground. It changes a little bit, but the overall behavior is the same. Right? So when we start to focus on the patterns, what's being used and abused the most, obviously there's going to be little things that can happen. But if 80-20 rule, if you can knock out the 80% with 20% of your efforts, you're in a really good place, right? And then you can start to focus on details from there or just maintain. Sometimes that's difficult. Keeping the lights on is hard enough, right? Then trying to actively defend on top of it becomes a little more difficult. It takes some effort, but it's worth the effort, especially if it really has a huge impact to the business.
Well, it's interesting because a lot of businesses have a lot of focus on quality, right? So when they deal with their customers, they put a lot of work and effort on the back end to make sure how they engage with the public, the customers, suppliers have a high quality predictability to it. So when the CISO looks across the table to the CIO and said, hey, dude, you own the asset management database. Hey, you own the patching of the systems after I let you know what you should patch first. Another team might be doing awareness training on like what people clicking on, not clicking on. So it's all these other teams across the table from the CISO that the CISO doesn't directly manage. So let's talk about this CISO on, being gentle, but like letting everybody know what their roles and responsibilities are. So if you have a board member clicking where you shouldn't be clicking, that's a problem as well. So everybody's in it. But unfortunately, as we've seen in the news a couple of times, CISOs seem to be the one that's taking a lot of this blame here. So let's talk about CISO role and just making sure everybody's on board here and doing their responsibilities. And some of those initiatives that have a big price tag might not be in the security budget. It's somebody else's budget, and they really need to kind of own up to that.
I think when you think about it from a CISO perspective, their job is to kind of wrangle all of that, right? The data owners are really the ones that own the risk. If you have a particular operation that you run, a particular program you run, and there's data that comes with that, you own that data, you own that risk, not the CISO. I think we're going after the wrong person. I'm going to be honest with you. The CISO doesn't have purview to everything. They're not always in the communication channel. And recently, there's a couple that have been really hit hard, held personally accountable when they didn't even have purview to certain things. So we're going after the wrong person. It probably, if you want change to happen, the CEO is the one that you should focus on. And, some people may or may not agree with that, but honestly, they're the captain of the ship. If you want change to happen, if you want real security to happen, that's the person you go after. That's the person ultimate responsible. Taking a step back and kind of looking at it big picture, whoever owns like IT, it's not typically the CISO, they own this, the security piece of it, or at least advise on it. There's lots of things that happen in IT, credentials, onboarding, offboarding of users, right? Possibly if you have external customers, onboarding, offboarding of external customers, right? A lot of those functions fall under IT, and so does the security responsibility. The CISO tries to direct, guide, and provide advice, right? Maybe becomes the auditing force for it. They audit those systems to make sure things are working right. But in all honesty, shouldn't be directly responsible for it.
So you mean not responsible for a developer hard coding the password, uploading source code to like a public GitHub and say, hey, what happened? Like, well, the CISO like, hey, we provided training for the developers, and this is something that shouldn't have happened. So it's amazing how much when you read the after action reports, how much a lot of the other teams' purview or responsibilities actually be built in as a quality, right? Hard coding the password, not bolting credentials, not using MFA because there's an initiative underway and it's legacy systems and now you're in year 4, year 5, year 6. And CISO can only do so much, right? So I don't know if they need to like change some colors on some executive dashboards or Like, hey guys, I'm asking about this. And like you said, if the captain of the ship, the CEO, sees those warning signs on dashboards and it's like year after year after year, then maybe they CISO say, this is our culture. This is our risk appetite. And if you guys are comfortable with it, I'll be comfortable with it. But we just want to make sure everybody signs their name and say, hey, we all agree to the same things. And I think a lot of times that doesn't happen, right? It's kind of inferred that, yeah, you kind of told me, but see, so that's technical stuff. You guys are too much technical jargon. Good to go. You just handle it.
It is. Oftentimes it's very technical. But yeah, I mean, what are we measuring? I think is a better question. You can have a lot of green, but if you're not measuring the right things, does that green really matter? And so how do we measure? What do we measure? What does that look like? Again, I'm a fan of the technical assessment. We have controls. How do we know the controls are working properly? How do we know people are doing the right things? How do we ensure that default passwords aren't set across devices? Vulnerability management's huge. How do we prioritize it? It's often more than we can handle. So there's a lot of aspects to it. And the question becomes, what are we measuring? If we're just measuring mean time to respond to an alert, what does that really mean? What about the quality of our response? Are we finding the adversary early? How do we measure that? What does that look like? Do we have a program in place for that? What is our visibility? I like to really focus on a complete visibility program. So looking at all of those aspects, looking at how the controls are working, looking at the vulnerability system and the prioritization of patching and where we sit. There's lots of ways of breach and attack simulation. I like the automated form of it because we can schedule it and run it and be consistent about it. But I also am a fan of the human element. I think it's important for either a red team or a pen test team to come in and verify, put that cognitive to it. So you can run automation and do a lot of really interesting testing, try to check the box the best you can, make sure things are working as expected. And then you bring in the human to verify, did we check all the boxes? Is it working as expected? Did we miss anything? Because the human is going to be able to pivot a little bit easier than a machine will, right? So things of that nature. But yeah, the real question is, what are we measuring and is it effective? And those are some of the things we need to focus on and stay consistent with. Again, actively looking, are we measuring the right things? Are we getting the right results? What did we miss and how? And using anything we did miss as a learning experience.
Yeah. So on this podcast, and we always talk about the critical thinking, systems thinking, and being intentional in designing what you want your outcomes to be. So I like what you're talking about, building that quality in up front. So if we're going to onboard new systems, we know we're going to have controls on them. We know how we allocate budget to handle it. And by the way, if we don't have a control for something that's required that IT just put up, that the marketing department got money for, but there's a line under the missing for additional controls for that. So the whole, remember, data used to sit in your own data center, and then we started migrating our workloads to the cloud. And then CISO was like, wasn't necessary in the loop there. Cause like, well, I need new tooling. Well, I need the vendors to catch up, security vendors to provide that. But at that point, the budget process passed me by already. So now I have data in two places. I have the existing controls for data center, but in the cloud, it looks different. So now sometimes CISOs feel like they're left out there in the wind trying to find extra money to go protect critical data that we protected it before, but somebody moved it, right? Cost, agility. We want the big cloud providers to take care of it. But we were flagging like, hey, we lost our visibility when we moved it. Or we used to inspect all this traffic, but then it's all SSL decrypted now. Do I need to decrypt it? Is there too much data to decrypt? Where is it being decrypted? Can I analyze it at scale? So every time IT moves, adjusts, changes in response to the business, the CISO and this team also got to make those adjustments. And it's right now, a lot of times the security budget and the requirements and the considerations seem to be an afterthought. So let's talk about the CISO, right? I mean, getting closer, right? Closer to when you see a CIO say, where you going now? What meeting you going to? Oh, don't worry about it. I'm going to talk to marketing about some effort. They're doing something with the AI, some third party developers and APIs. I'll let you know later. She's like, whoa, I need to be in that meeting.
Well, you bring up a good point, right? I can tell you, I've been over 2 decades in this industry. And when I first came on, one of the biggest fights I had was building security from the ground up. They use security as a checkbox. They do all the development, build out the entire program, get everything going. They come in and say, okay, security, come check it out, come make sure it's good. come in, you rip it to shreds and be like, that's not going to work. We got to redo the whole thing. Well, you should have brought us in from the get-go. We could have alleviated this. So a couple
Yes.
of those kinds of learning experiences led to bringing security in from the ground up. Any of these new initiatives need to have a security look initially, make sure that security is on track. So when it comes time to roll it out, the security is already built in. Those thought processes are in place. What are the risks? And it may just be, we understand that risk and we accept it, but it's bringing in the CISO early or bringing in the security team early, whoever that may be, right? The engineers, the architects, the CISO, and understanding that risk is key. So it's a battle that I personally have fought for a long time, and I can understand where that comes from. But that's a cultural thing. Again, that
Yeah.
starts to really go towards the top. This captain of the ship. We want to be a security culture before we roll programs out and understand the tech we're bringing in. We want to have a security focus on this. We want to make sure we minimize business impact so we don't have to deal with the breach. Or if we do deal with the breach, it's minimal impact because we did the right things up front instead of after the fact. It's been an ongoing battle for the whole time I've been doing this, and it's still an ongoing battle.
So I want to ask you for Derek, top 3 ways for the CISO to sneak in and get intel on what the counterparts are doing across the organization. Because somebody like marketing does, like obviously one of the marketing is a popular one. They need to share data, do some mining on it. And then some person may be just by default uploading some data to an Amazon S3 bucket. Or there's this new third-party contractor for development. And they say, oh, by the way, we're going to need to access your database. So we have an API. Here's the API key. And then who's managing that? So it like sneaks in at every little component, and the CISO isn't everywhere. It's almost like, okay, guys, I sent you the guidelines to make sure you run this by me at some point during the process, right? Especially if you're going to spend months and months putting up a new system or a new integration. There's enough time to make sure security can get their eyeballs on it and say, what's going on here? So in 2024, it's still a little surprising. So I know if you look online, there's a lot of online channel about CISOs and how they're communicating with their colleagues. And is it a business conversation? Is it a breakdown of how they're presenting it? Are they using too much technical jargon to business folks? Like, what are you seeing where some of those areas are really happening? Because we expected this like maybe 10 years ago, that'd have been fine 5 years ago, but to still have systems and data being moved to places that's not under organizational controls, it just still seems a little surprising to me.
Well, I mean, you have third parties. Oftentimes we share with third parties, and you're seeing this a lot in the news media. Third party gets popped, and so does your data sitting with the third party. So kind of surprising, but at the same time, it kind of makes sense, right? We can't really hold everything in house all the time. We do look to partners. We do look to others to help us out in certain areas, right? From the CISO perspective, I think there's security standards, right? There's policies or procedures. If you put the guardrails in place up front, right? You don't necessarily have to be in every conversation as long as people are looking at those policies, those standards, and abiding by them. Your job is kind of to audit. Hey, I noticed this happened on my daily audit, my weekly audit, my monthly audit, whatever the case may be. What's going on here? Clearly, the policy states this. So staying on top of it's hard when you're trying to keep the lights on, but those are the kinds of things you need to kind of think about, being proactive as possible. But by setting those guardrails, by having standards and policies and procedures in place, hopefully that minimizes some of the CISO having to be everywhere. So setting that up front takes a lot of effort to get it in up front, but it's a worthwhile effort.
So now let's kind of shift to kind of those outside the organization that can really help the CISO out, right? So now we talk about those who make the products that we consume that have a lot of reputation on the line and a lot of incentive to get it right. So the code that they push out to the world that we buy and consume is very advantageous for them to get it right. So they don't have an exploit later that causes a whole lot of problems. So when the third party is trusted, and we did our due diligence, highly reputable, and they shift to left, by the way. They're way, way left. They shift to left. They have all these processes in place, and then you get that notification. Someone just identified a vulnerability on the system that has credentials that are allowed to manage thousands of my systems. Like, oh wow, what just happened there? The vendor was clean, the processes were clean, and then they get a problem. And then it's okay, they fix the problem and we patch, we're back up and running. And a couple months later, they come back again and say, hey, bad guy just found another vulnerability. Another one? Same vendor? And then another one. And then at some point, they say, you know what? To make it easy on operations, we're just going to do it on a Tuesday every month. What? Every month? And we have a schedule to make it easy on you. So what happens when private and governmental agencies all rely on one extremely large entity that's invests billions of dollars on it, and it forces us to do lots and lots of extra work every month, and it has no productivity gain. It's just that bad guys have found another problem in the code that you put out to the world. So talk about this, putting pressure on the CISO. They're like, hey, you guys aren't getting it right, and you guys got more money than us.
Patch management is tough. And let's face it, we're all human. Mistakes happen. It's going to happen. I like CISA's push for secure by design, secure by default, right? They're also pushing for common vulnerabilities that we've had the ability and means to minimize for a very long time, but we seem to ignore that. So there's some initiatives happening at the CISA level to really drive security by default, security by design. And I really like those initiatives. And I like the idea of minimizing the amount of patching we need to do. Some vendors are better at the vulnerability side than others. Some I like to call Swiss cheese. They're very, very difficult to keep up with. Others do a fairly decent job. It's always going to happen, right? So how do we prioritize it? And what does that look like? I think those initiatives that are being driven by CISA are huge. And if we can get them commonplace, we start to minimize that impact, which means our jobs are easier. But in the meantime, what do? We can prioritize patching to help at least minimize the business impact. There was a report that was put out at the end of the year looking at 2023. And what they found was less than 1% of all the vulnerabilities from 2023 were high risk. In other words, they were being actively exploited or they were extremely exploitable and the ability was there. Less than 1%. So you can start to think about prioritization and what that means to us. The simple fact is that you can take informational and low vulnerabilities and chain a bunch of them together, and you can still get the same result as a single, like high critical or even medium vulnerability that is able to create a massive impact. All vulnerabilities are important. The patching side is important. But if we prioritize what matters most, at the very least, we minimize business impact. So actively exploited vulnerabilities, you can start with the CISA Keeve database. There's some other Keeve databases. So Keeve is the known exploited vulnerabilities, right? So you can start there. That's your number one priority. That's what's being used and abused either now or has been. It has the potential to continue to be. And if you watch the news media, you'll see that both nation states and criminals, right, are using older vulnerabilities from 2014, 2016, 2017, 2020, right? Just because it's old doesn't mean it's not being abused. And that's why looking at a database like that and prioritizing what we know is actively exploited is priority number one. Proof of concept code available that is weaponized is priority number two, because chances are if there's a weaponized POC exploit available, so proof of concept code available, it's going to be utilized. Right? So priority two, you do those two things. And then of course you want to focus on outside. So internet exposed first, right? And move your way in, because even if they get a foothold, they can go after those vulnerabilities internally. A perfect example is like, trying to think of a good one. Well, some of the VMware ones was a good one. There was some other ones that everybody was focused on the external side, but were heavily abused internally, right? Yeah. Once they gained initial access and used for lateral movement. And this happens quite often. So really thinking about prioritization from that standpoint, and then focusing for the future on minimizing that with some of the secure by design, secure by default kind of things that should be standard, to be honest. You think about it from a firewall perspective, firewalls come pretty much wide open, and then it's up to you to go through and tune it, right? And to harden it and make it good. What if it came hardened out of the gate and it was up to you to lessen it, lessen its ability, right? Now the onus is on you and what you create versus trying to have the right level of talent, the right people to come in and actually harden everything up. So it's those kinds of initiatives that are going to help change the game for us and make it more difficult for the adversary. And the key here is make it as difficult as possible for the adversary to gain their objectives. The more we do that, the higher the campaign costs, especially from a ransomware, criminal, and fraudster perspective. The ones that are going after the financial aspect, the more costly it is, the less money they make, the better off we are as an industry. So those are the kinds of things we want to focus on. And by the way, it has a tendency to minimize the business impact as well. Should we get an incident or have a data breach, right? We can start to minimize that impact.
Yeah, no, which are the two key pieces of risk, right? Risk management, right? Having some effect on likelihood and a correlated to that, to the frequency of something bad happening, and then what's that impact is. And a lot of times the impact is affected by the breach radius, how much data we're talking about. And I think we may have had a conversation maybe with you or somebody else about companies holding on to data that they don't need to hold on to. And then they have the breach, and all of a sudden they got to report this higher number of records. They said, man, we should have got rid of that a long time ago. It's not getting into lifecycle management of the data that you have. It's like, and then you see the breach report said, well, don't worry about it. It was from 10 years ago. Like, why are you guys holding on to that? Which again is not CISO, right? So that's another group, another cultural process, framework is required to say, only collect what you need, get rid of it when you don't need it. So when something does bad happen, and then it's not all over the place, and you get the larger fines and larger impacts at the notify more people. So I do like this CISO as kind of this, like you mentioned, kind of quarterback in, and you might have said the word auditor. We need something friendlier, like cajoler, not someone to encourage some more
auditor, like an auditor.
Yeah. Improve quality and things that we can scale. It helps us out later. So when they do get in, something happens, it's not as bad. So we've talked a little about tooling as well. So obviously most people do the annual pen test. But I do like to talk a little bit more about the scaling your efforts, because after the manual pen test over at the end of the year, IT moves stuff around. So you got different infrastructure out there, different exposures. So let's talk a little bit more about scaling IT's efforts after that human-driven pen test throughout the rest of the year, something more than just a vulnerability assessment. I know you mentioned BAS, and I know you maybe got some other approaches out there to help, give CISO more bang and scale and reach, on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, BAS, automated BAS, right, is a really good one. You can schedule testing to run consistently. There are some nuances to it, right? It does create a lot of noise. So you want to have mechanisms to understand that noise. But when you go through and do consistent testing, you really get a picture of what your systems look like. And if you do the right level of testing and you do it across a wide swath of infrastructure, you really get a feel for your strengths and your weaknesses and where things sit. You can find misconfigurations. So if you're testing bi-weekly and you test one time and the next week your number drops substantially, something changed. This allows you to see it and address it very quickly. The majority of problem set from a breach perspective is human error, right? We get that from Verizon's DBIR. We get that from other reports. The most consistent element there is some sort of human error, whether they clicked a link, it's a misconfiguration, whatever the case may be. So consistently testing and understanding our environments the best that we can. When you're talking about breach and attack SIM, usually it's representative. So you'll look at your gold standards, your gold images, you'll look at your firewalls and your various areas, cloud, data center, user environments, other environments, sites and zones, right? And make sure that your standards are set, that you have consistency across the board. Your security standard is it pushed in a way that is doing the most good that it can. And if you do find a misconfiguration, you can see it quickly and do something about it. Find the problem and fix the problem before the adversary finds it and abuses it. So a continuous visibility capability, which includes a lot of different things, BAS and scanning and asset inventory and vulnerability management. When you start to look at all of these things and you layer them in over time, you start to get a really good adversarial view of your environment. You can find misconfigurations quickly and you can minimize business impact. You start to throw segmentation in, right? Enclaves to protect your really, really business critical processes and things that the adversary goes after, like Active Directory. Should be enclaved, minimal access, minimal ability for an adversary to abuse it. It's when you start to really focus and dial in and you have that complete visibility picture across your environment, that consistent visibility over time, you can find those things, fix those things, and really, really move your program forward.
I like that because it's not all like gloom and doom. It's the one when you find out like somebody been in your environment for like 18 months, like, oh, 18 months. We thought like, hey, we didn't patch for a couple of days and they jumped in right there. Sometimes they happen, but most cases, it's like long lagging things we need to fix on our to-do list that we haven't got to. But when it's like months and months and months and months piling up, it's like at some point, that's a process problem. It's the way our systems are designed. And a lot of that design happens by budgets. You heard of the old adage, people are designing by budget. It's like you're getting for what you're paying for, right? That's what that looks like. So may have some crappy tools or not enough resources. But if you look at the annual budget, right, that organizations have, that's a reflection of the priority that they set. And obviously they have a lot of initiatives, a lot of competing priorities across the board. And as you said, you go back to the executive suite, they understand the risk appetite, the actual exposure across the entire organization from an enterprise view. Then they can take cyber into consideration and make that determination. And if they really feel like, man, we're really lagging behind, they can do something about it, right? Not only with the funding, but the helping build that culture of, be aware of what's going on, report something strange, protecting your credentials, not doing these weird things and clicking on these strange places not related to business. Or like, hey, they missed your pickup here for a delivery from UPS at the corporate office. Like, what? I didn't remember doing that. Hold on. Don't click on that. Be careful. It's like everybody's doing their role and responsibility to really overall reduce risk. So Derek, if you got some folks coming up through the ranks, 4 or 5 years in management, mid-management, coming up and looking and thinking, you know what, I might want to be a CISO one day, but I'm worried, man. It's like they're gonna blame me for everything. So I'm looking around like, how does the organization deal with the security team? Is it like a partnership? Is it like antagonistic? They're peeking around the corner, figuring out on the career path, is this a good role to target this? Get any thoughts about becoming a CISO, say in the next 5 years for people who are listening to this show right now?
Well, things are changing a little bit, right? With CISOs being held accountable, you want to make sure that you get on the D&O insurance policy, right? You want to make sure you're treated as an executive. You want to make sure that when you're having those discussions, that the right processes are going to be put in place, that you're going to get the backing that you need, the support that you need, those kinds of things. But in general, they're starting to split the CISO role a little bit. It's going to be privacy. You may have data and CISO, right? And that's simply because there's so much to it. Yeah. And it kind of makes sense if you think about it. And then at the same time, a lot of your CISOs are starting to move to different roles like COO, CIO, CTO, because they can bring that security piece to it as well. So that'll leaves room for others to come up to the CISO role and focus on security, while the CISO takes on some other roles within an organization and applies that security mindset to it. We start to get that security from the ground up mentality, which will start to move the needle quite a bit in a lot of organizations. So yeah, just things to think about. Make sure that you got coverage there. Make sure you're going to get supported properly, that you kind of vet that out as you're moving up. Get really good at what you do. Understand the tech. From a CISO perspective, you don't have to know everything, right? You want to be deep in 3 or 4 different domains, and you want to be broad across the rest. So you have a really big picture view of the tech, how it works. And you don't have to be highly technical. You need to understand it, because you're the one that has to make sure that when you're looking at it, when you're auditing, when you're sharing the risk information with whether it's business folks or others, that they understand the risk, that they're responsible for the risk, and that you guys are putting the right mitigations and thought process in place. And then, of course, the risk appetite side of it. Here's the interesting thing. Yeah. I always see this. The risk appetite is gigantic until there's an incident. And then all of a sudden, the risk appetite shrinks quite a bit, right? Something to think about as well as you're going through this. But if you're proactive and you put the right things in place, you can do a really good job, and you can minimize any impact that comes that way. Just take a look at that as you go. You mentioned the business side, and I read an article not that long ago that talked about your security program has been built from a long, long time period, and maybe we need to rethink it, relook at it. And then you also mentioned budget. You're budget focused. So at some point, it might make a lot of sense to really step back and take a look at your IT stack, your security stack, your program as a whole, and all your programs that fall under that umbrella, and say, do we really need this? Can we do a better job? Is this the right
Yeah.
tool for the job? Should we do some consolidation? We have 3 tools here. Will one do? What's the best one to use? If you can get one really good tool instead of having 3 tools, you
Yeah.
start to minimize a lot of things: operations, management overhead, costs. I'm a fan of a very small tool set that does a lot of things.
Oh,
So
okay.
looking at your budget and then looking big picture across everything, do you really need some things? When I come in and consult for some organizations every once in a while, I notice they have a gigantic tool stack that's been there for a long time. They don't even know what half those tools are doing. Sometimes the team is already gone and they just keep paying for the tool. But there's lots of things to look at to open your budget up. Think about operational efficiency. We have 10 tools in our perimeter. We can probably use one instead of 10, right? Point product that's coming up over time, right? So looking at next gen firewall, looking at layer 7 firewalls, minimizing those communication channels and the abuse of them. With those kinds of capabilities, you get a whole lot of tool set in one area, one piece. Makes it simpler, gives you a lot of features and functionality. So just things to think about across the board.
But that brings a good point. Like this other role, the role not only is people moving up for the CISO role, but also someone who's actually designing intentionally by design upfront security quality. So on the IT side, we all talk about enterprise architects. But on the security side, there's security architecture in there when we talk about capabilities and different components. So that's a great career path for some people who might be in an adjacent area who's thinking about, maybe I'll just do cloud architecture security today or infrastructure. Maybe I want to see how the different pieces connect. How do they talk? What's the communications? How do we move and onboarding things securely? So talk a little about that career pathing for people who are thinking about, I want to think more about the system as a whole and all these complexity. But I like complexity. We got a lot of techies who like the complexity, and they might want to move up a level off of hands-on keyboard to maybe, I want to design these components very intentional to support what the CISO is doing.
Architecture is a great career path, and you do get a big picture view, and you're still pretty much hands-on keyboard, maybe not quite as much as like on the engineering side, because you are looking at a larger swath of things. And it's a huge support path for the CISO and for IT in general, right? So yeah, definitely cloud comes into it. If you think about cloud, the way I like to think about cloud is just somebody else's infrastructure. It's somebody else's data center. It works pretty much the same depending on what you're doing. With infrastructure as a service, if you look at the shared responsibility model, you're still responsible for the majority of security and operations, and even in the cloud, right? So keep that in mind when you're moving to the cloud or thinking about the cloud. A lot of it is infrastructure, unless you're doing something like platform as a service, or if you're working with SaaS companies, right, software as a service, then the responsibility starts to shrink a little bit. But there's still quite a bit of responsibility there. But yeah, architecture in general, whether you do enterprise architect or even security architect, they're kind of the same. Just one has more of a security focus, right? If they're looking at it from the security perspective, the other is looking at it from an operations perspective. I think you should look at both. I think both paths should have an equal thought process around security, working with the right people. And everybody doesn't have to know everything. Just having enough overlap within your team for people that have the right knowledge will give you what you need.
I love that. I mean, just so many different pathways in security. I mean, to branch out, to kind of map out where you want to go. If your hands of the day, maybe doing engineering work and maybe going to understand a little bit more about the attacker's mindset and his tactics, that true blue defender, or looking at architecture, how the different components work together. And I think earlier you mentioned privacy, dealing with this data, how you manage that, onboard data, lifecycle management. And then so just so many different avenues here. So I mean, it's an exciting time, man, to be in security. I'm excited for what people can see and view. And obviously we did not mention a 2-letter acronym the entire show. Can I do it? Should I throw it in there just to wrap up the show?
Go ahead.
AI. So security folks want to think about, hey, how do you secure AI? How do you think about it? And look at the implications. So there's a never ending pathway to learning more, getting new skill sets and moving up and around. So I'm pretty excited for the industry and the profession as itself. So as we come to kind of wind down the show, is there anything we haven't covered that you wanted to make mention about this kind of the security landscape, how we validate that our controls are working, or anything else we've covered so far?
I mean, I think we've mentioned it, threat intel, and really paying attention to threat intel on a weekly basis and using that to help guide, right? Active and consistent visibility across all of your infrastructure. The very things that we've been talking about are huge. I don't think we miss too much in general, just having a casual discussion. But yeah, for anybody that's interested, I do a newsletter on a weekly. So when I do that, when I talk about looking at the threat landscape on a weekly basis, I decided to share that with folks. You're welcome to sign up and check it out. 31337 InfoSec. And it's just a quick view. I look at 350 to 450 cyber threat news articles a week, curate them, go through and pull out the stuff that is threat trend and adversarial specific, pattern and behavior specific. So just ways to keep up without you having to do all the research if anybody's interested.
Yeah, definitely a great resource. And we'll include a link in the show notes for that. Well, cool, Derek, man. This has been a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, appreciate you having me. It's been great. I love talking shop, by the way.
I know. We'll do more episodes in the future. There's just so much to cover.
Sounds good. There's a ton to cover, right? We can focus on a given area and it can be an entire episode easily.
Well, cool. Well, we're going to wrap this episode up for right now. This has been another episode of the Smart IT Podcast. And until next time, take care. Thanks for joining another episode of the Smart IT Podcast, where we explore what's next for IT and disrupt the status quo, simplify the complex, and reduce risk together. If you like what you hear, please like, subscribe, and leave your comments. And for more Smart IT wisdom, check out my website at williamreed.info.